want to say a few things with this video about the neoclassical stages of integration. If you can understand and wrap your mind around the stages of integration, you can unpack both the politics and economics that clash in the context of international political economy. They're revealed starkly in understanding these neoclassical stages of integration. And so I want to take a few minutes and go through what each of the categories are and what some of the implications are for each of those stages of integration. A good place to begin thinking about the stages of integration is actually with commercial policies. Commercial policies is essentially that list of government measures imposed either at the border or behind the border that is really the substance, the agenda of the international trading regime. When countries get together, it's over these commercial policies that they're negotiating and bargaining. And with each stage of integration contemplated by countries, we're also talking about this list of commercial policies. And as you deepen and descend into ever deeper stages of integration, more and more of these commercial policies become the substance of negotiation. Note here that once you get beyond tariffs, import quotas, and maybe a couple of other issues, they're published, they're transparent, they're very publicly available. You can go and find what a country's tariffs are, what their rates are, and how they're imposed at borders. But once you get beyond these first couple of items on these commercial policies, we're getting into a number of issues around sovereignty. Things that are very difficult for governments to give up or for governments to liberalize and harmonize with one another. So for example, government procurement. That's governments letting contracts for road construction, sewer repair, transportation infrastructure. Well, allowing foreign entities to make bids on those contracts at the same rates as domestic firms can get a little difficult sometimes. And so once you deepen, as you go into ever deeper stages of integration, in these stages of integration, you're dealing with commercial policies deeper and deeper into this list that have a lot of political sensitivity. Robert Pastor once described the process of trade liberalization as being akin to draining a swamp. As the water level drops, it reveals all kinds of stumps and snags. The swamp is pretty messy. Well, the same thing can be applied when we think about those commercial policies, the substance, the agenda of the global trading agenda, the substance of negotiations between countries. Once you get past tariffs and import quotas, the water level drops. It reveals some very difficult things over which to negotiate. Everything as you drop further in that list of commercial policies becomes much more difficult for countries to deal with, much more difficult for countries to concede or grant concessions to their negotiating partners. The stumps and the snags of the swamp become some of the most difficult problems in international trade because they're often not as transparent as tariffs or import quotas. So again, as the water level drops, those stumps and snags are revealed. The more difficult topics in trade liberalization become apparent. So when we get to the stages of integration, the categories of the stages of integration, we can also think about the increasing difficulty and the politics of trying to negotiate away some of those commercial policies. But start first with a preferential trading arrangement. This is among the most shallow and the easiest of preferences arrangements that countries can negotiate because it often includes liberalization of tariffs, barriers at the border, tariffs and quotas, primarily in a single sector of the economy. Great example of this is the Canada-US Auto Pact from the 1960s, which liberalized trade, liberalized the barriers to trade in a single sector, automobiles and auto parts. It's a very shallow arrangement. All they do is eliminate tariffs at the borders. There's no shared sovereignty. There's no pooling of institutions, simply eliminating barriers to trade in a single sector. The next stage of economic integration is a free trade area. This is a deeper stage of integration because it takes a preferences arrangement, that liberalization in a single sector, and expands it to every sector. So the best example here that we can think of is the NAFTA. In 1994, Canada, the United States, and Mexico got together and substantially eliminated all barriers to trade on every sector of their economy. Services, agriculture, manufacturing, everything that the three countries trade, they tried to eliminate nearly all barriers. An important dimension of free trade areas that is worth noting is the fact that there's a very shallow level of institutionalization. In fact, there's none. In a free trade area, the three countries in the NAFTA, for example, may liberalize trade amongst all three of them, but they maintain their own tariff schedules vis-a-vis non-members. So both Canada, the United States, and Mexico have all maintained separate tariff schedules vis-a-vis imports from the European Union or from China. So it's important to note that this is a very shallow stage of integration. A very shallow institutionalization takes place under the NAFTA. None of the three countries really gives up a lot of sovereignty. They've liberalized, they've agreed not to impose certain barriers to trade on goods originating in those three NAFTA countries, but they do not share a common tariff schedule. They do not share a common institutionalization. And so it's a very shallow arrangement, a free trade area, where it comes to institutionalization and sovereignty. Now, what we were just saying about sovereignty and institutionalization is really important when we think about the next stage of economic integration, a customs union. So effectively, imagine the NAFTA area, only this time there is some degree of institutionalization because all three countries under a customs union would have the same tariff schedule vis-a-vis the European Union or imports from Asia, meaning Canada, the United States, and Mexico would pool their resources, pool their tariff schedules vis-a-vis imports from outside North America. Rather than maintaining separate tariff schedules as they do under the NAFTA, under a very shallow free trade area, the customs union contemplates a deepening of the institutionalization, a pooling of sovereignty by harmonizing their tariff schedule and also harmonizing their customs officials, the way that they assess tariffs at each of the ports, whether they be in Mexico, in Canada, or the United States. There is a pooling of institutionalization around the application of tariffs and quotas and other measures at borders to non-member imports. So imports from Europe, Asia, anything entering North America under a customs union would have tariffs and quotas levied by a common harmonized tariff schedule and presumably a set of customs officials that were agreed to by all three countries. The next stage of economic integration is a common market. And notice in the previous stages that we've talked about, a preferences arrangement, a free trade area, or a customs union, there's no discussion of labor. All we're talking about are tariffs and other measures levied on goods, on stuff, things that move around the country. But there's no labor mobility. You and I, we can't go get a job in Mexico tomorrow or the United States. We're limited in terms of where we can apply our labor. A common market changes all of that, and it liberalizes all mobility to the movement of both goods and the factors of production, meaning labor, people. So people can move throughout a common market and get a job virtually anywhere inside that common market. And so that's a significant deepening of the stages of integration because we're talking about the harmonization of labor policies in all member countries. All the members of a common market would harmonize their labor laws, would apply their labor laws in the same way. We may even harmonize or create a common labor relations ministry, for example, to adjudicate the entire common market. And so that is a much deeper stage of integration because you're eliminating the ability of each country to apply their own labor laws, and you're harmonizing those labor laws among those three countries. You're agreeing to a set of labor laws and the rules governing labor that will be applied to all three countries all at the same time. Once we move away from a common market, we often move into monetary union. The most obvious example of monetary union is obviously the euro area in Europe, where each of the euro area members gave up their original currencies. So where Germany used to have a Deutschmark, The Italians used to have a lira and the French had a franc. They now have the euro. And what this implies is a deep pooling of sovereignty around monetary policy. Each of the member countries' central banks no longer has control over its currency. All of that is managed out of a single European central bank based in Frankfurt. And so this is a tremendous pooling of sovereignty, one that is very sensitive. People like to have their currency. People like to have the symbols on their currency. There's a bit of pride sometimes attached to currencies. And so this was a very difficult step in Europe, a very profound step, but one that at the same time created a lot of efficiencies throughout Europe, where you don't have exchange rate differentials and so on. But that efficiency comes at a price. It comes at a price of sovereignty, where those countries agree to pool their monetary policies in a single location, where they will have a vote, but they won't necessarily be able to carry the day and do so on the basis of their own national interests. It's more of a collective kind of interest. And so you can see the sensitivities, political sensitivities around monetary union right away. The next stage of economic integration is economic union. And this involves the harmonization not just of monetary policy, not just of labor mobility, for example, under a common market, but this involves the harmonization of virtually every conceivable economic policy among member countries. This includes fiscal policy, the ability of governments to spend money, to set budgets. All of that can be centralized and pooled under an economic union. And there are great efficiencies that can come from that, from pooling it, rather than having a group of many small countries trying to do their own thing, trying to sort out their fiscal arrangements. Collectivize it, pool their sovereignty around their budget issues, around the budget making, around the allocation of budgets in an economic zone, such as the European Union, for example. That also includes regulation. Common regulation, rather than having each country apply different regulations, confusing and slowing the ability of commercial activity. Pool that sovereignty, collectivize that decision making, centralize that decision making. But as you can imagine, that doesn't come without its own politics, and so it's been very difficult for the European Union over the last 5 or 10 years to move from that monetary union to an economic union. They've had a number of challenges on this front, and it hasn't been smooth, but they keep inching further and further towards that goal of full economic union and the efficiency that comes with it. One way to think about economic union is to think about Canada. Canada, in many ways, a federal state of 10 provinces and 3 territories, has various jurisdictional boundaries. Provinces have a lot of power. Ottawa tries to incentivize and bring the provinces together. Ottawa has specific spheres of authority. Provinces have other spheres of authority. And there's a kind of fight that goes on all the time in Canadian federalism to try and eliminate or harmonize some of the barriers to interprovincial trade, for example. So Canada is still working towards full economic union. It's obviously a deeper form of economic union than some jurisdictions, some central states, but Canada's still working on a lot of this because you have powerful provinces with jurisdiction over important areas of policy, for example, natural resource exploitation and extraction. And so different provinces have different rules around that. And so part of what Canada has been doing in the context of federalism has been trying to harmonize those rules. Well, it's a little bit similar to what's going on in the European Union as they strive to get closer and closer to economic union, where you have a harmonized, centralized kind of regulatory, fiscal, and monetary union that brings about a lot of efficiencies, but also eliminates some of those barriers to trade. But that's hard for governments to give up, as you can imagine. The politics of that become a little bit fraught and difficult as countries negotiate and try to eliminate some of those barriers and harmonize some of those barriers, pool that sovereignty amongst themselves. From economic union, it's not a great leap of logic to imagine political union, the final stage of the stages of economic integration. Here, we're essentially talking about the elimination of individual state legislatures, national legislatures, national leadership, pooling all of that into a single legislature. The European Union doesn't quite contemplate this. Each country still maintains its own legislature, its own elected members, its own prime ministers and presidents, but it does have a centralized European Parliament. Every country sends members of the European Parliament to that legislature, a kind of Europe-wide national legislature. Now, you can think about this political union in the context of federal states like Canada and the United States. At one point, the United States was a rather fractious collection of 13 colonies. The American Revolution changed that, and you've seen the United States over the subsequent 200 plus years of its existence trying to knit first that 13 original colonies together into a single cohesive whole, and then the 50 states. Similarly in Canada. Canada's economic history, its political history, has in some ways been driven by that effort to centralize and harmonize some of what would ordinarily be a fractious group of provinces and territories. And so you can think of these stages of economic integration as ultimately coming around to what looks like a cohesive country, a single country, even a federal country like Canada, but a cohesive country that is largely unified under a kind of single set of policies. So in Figure 1, it kind of summarizes a lot of what I've been saying up until this point about the trade-offs around the degrees of integration, the stages of integration. As you deepen, as you go down the list of stages of integration, from preferences agreement through free trade area, customs union, common market, et cetera, it inherently implies a degree of pooling of sovereignty. As you eliminate more and more of those commercial policies, you're talking about the increasing pooling of institutions as well to manage that elimination. Customs union, common market, monetary and economic union, political union, all entail a pooling of sovereignty. Sovereignty that's very difficult for populations, for governments to really cede or to give up. And so the argument for doing so has to be pretty strong. It typically swirls around the economic benefits, the efficiency benefits, taking small little units that are inefficient, small jurisdictions that are inefficient, pooling their resources together for the purposes of efficiency. But as we get down to deeper stages of integration, some of those efficiency gains also come with politically sensitive things. So for example, monetary union sounds great, might be very efficient, but a lot of us like our currencies. And so sometimes it's very difficult to give up. And interestingly, if you look to the European Union, not every member of the European Union is also a member of the Eurozone. And so there's been some sensitivity around that, notably Great Britain. Britain, of course, is getting out of the European Union altogether, but for a very long time it was a member of the European Union, but never adopted the euro. It always maintained the pound, partly because British citizens kind of like the Queen on their pound. And so with each ever deepening stage of integration, we're also talking about increasing constraints on one's sovereignty. As you get through customs union, common market, monetary union, etc., you're giving up pieces of your sovereignty that in some cases are very politically sensitive. And so there are these trade-offs that come with the stages of economic integration, but you can also see in studying them the clash of economics and politics that we study in IPE. Another way to depict this trade-off between economic efficiency and sovereignty is depicted here in Figure 1.1, where on the far left, up top, you have maximum state sovereignty in the form of autarky. If the international system is governed by autarky, meaning you don't trade with anybody, you don't actually have any connections with the outside world, you produce and consume everything internal to your own borders, well, you have maximum sovereignty. But the moment you begin starting to trade and you engage, for example, in a preferences scheme, you're in a sense binding yourself to commitments, even if it's in a single sector like the Auto Pact, for example. Preferences schemes involve a kind of ceding of some sovereignty to reap the economic benefits of those preferences arrangements in a single sector. When you move to a free trade area, it's still very shallow, very maximum kind of amount of sovereignty, but you get a large number of benefits. Customs union, this is where you begin pooling a significant amount of sovereignty because you're applying a common set of tariffs to everybody that is a non-member. So whereas in a free trade area, you maintain your separate tariff schedules vis-a-vis non-free trade area members, in a customs union, you pool that. And you have a common tariff schedule, you have a common set of officials managing the application of tariffs and quotas and so on imports from non-members. And so you're inherently giving up a little bit of sovereignty because you're pooling that tiny bit of sovereignty. Common market, similarly, the big change here is that you're talking about the liberalization of labor mobility. People in all countries of the member area of a common market can move around and get jobs anywhere. It entails a common set of labor policies, a common set of labor laws, and a common set of officials to adjudicate and make those laws. And so common market tends to get a little bit dicey. Note here that in North America, we don't have anything approaching a customs union or a common market. It's a very shallow kind of trading arrangement. And in spite of its shallowness, it has been controversial since its inception in 1994. But note how shallow it is. There is no pooling of sovereignty in North America. But once we get to monetary union, common market, monetary union, we're really talking about significant degrees of pooled sovereignty. And the best example here, of course, is the European Union. But even in the European Union, not all member countries of the European Union are also part of the monetary union. Not all countries in Europe use the euro. And so a subset of European Union members have adopted the euro. They're not quite comfortable, everybody, with adopting the euro. And then finally, political union. And here we can think of federal states, the origins of the United States and Canada as kind of fractious jurisdictions that ultimately came together, pooled their sovereignty, and now have a relative harmony across the continent. And so there you're talking about the deepest form of pooled sovereignty because you're pooling your elected members, all of your governance sovereignty in a single entity.